few months ago, I was invited to the headquarters of a major regional utility provider. I sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room with their chief sustainability officer. He was energized, practically glowing, as he walked me through a slide deck about their new ecological equity framework. He was particularly proud of their latest hire, a director of narrative integration, who ensured that every internal memo reflected their commitment to social cohesion. He spoke with the fervor of a man who believed he was building the future, pointing to a certificate on the wall that gave the company a top-tier ESG score. To him, that piece of paper was the ultimate proof of success. But then the air conditioning cut out. Then the lights flickered and died. A transformer had blown 3 miles away, the 4th one that month. When I asked him if the director of narrative integration had any thoughts on the aging grid infrastructure or the 15% vacancy rate in their electrical engineering department, his face went blank. It wasn't anger, it was a total lack of comprehension. He looked at the darkened room, then back at his slide deck, and said, "Our reporting metrics are the best in the industry. These outages are just external noise." That blank stare, that absolute refusal to acknowledge that the physical world was no longer obeying his spreadsheets, is the defining image of 2026. It felt like watching a patient with a terminal autoimmune disease insist they were healthy because their paperwork was filed in the correct color-coded folders. We are currently performing an autopsy of competence. From the crumbling bridges of the interior to the flickering grids of the coast, we are witnessing reality's ultimate reprisal against ideology. Concrete and steel do not care about narrative integration, yet we have built a managerial class that has forgotten how to speak the language of physics. The question we have to ask ourselves today isn't breaking, it's whether the people in charge even realize they're broken.
Wow. That is, that's a chilling way to start, that blank stare.
It stays with you, doesn't it?
Yes, because it's not just about a power outage, it's about a cognitive outage, a total disconnect from reality.
Exactly. And that feeling, that sensation of watching someone stare at a real-world disaster because it just doesn't compute with their internal story, that's really the heart of this deep dive.
So this is what we're doing today, an autopsy of competence.
That's the mission. We're stripping away the jargon, the buzzwords, the frameworks, and we are looking at the actual machinery of civilization.
An autopsy, though, I mean, that implies something has died, or is at least on the operating table.
I think critical condition is putting it mildly. The whole point of today is to look at this collision. It's a collision between two, irresistible forces. On one side, you have narrative.
The stories, the frameworks, the press releases, the mission statements, the ESG scores.
The job titles, Director of Narrative Integration. That's a real title. And on the other side of that collision, you have physics.
The hard stuff. The unyielding reality of the physical world. Voltage, load-bearing capacity, friction, thermodynamics.
Stuff that doesn't care about your feeling.
Or your slide deck.
Exactly. Physics doesn't negotiate. And the thesis we're exploring today, based on this huge stack of internal reports, engineering papers, sociological studies, is that we've built a civilization that has forgotten how to negotiate with physics because it's just too busy negotiating with itself.
We've confused the map for the territory. That's the classic mistake.
Yeah.
We think if we just keep changing the map, the spreadsheet, the report, the framework, then the territory will magically change to match it.
But the transformer 3 miles away doesn't get the memo.
No, it does not.
We have a lot to get through. We're going to start with the physics of failure, looking at the electrical grid itself. We're going to talk about this concept of grid entropy, which sounds like something out of science fiction, but it's terrifyingly real.
And then we move from the physical to the psychological, the bureaucratic.
Yes, the pathology of bureaucracy. We'll dig into something called the Perversity thesis, which is fascinating. Then we'll look at the chaotic attempts to fix all of this with the DOGE reforms.
And how that backfired.
And finally, we're going to ask a really important question. Where are the competent people hiding? Which brings us to this idea of the parallel polis.
It's a big journey from a substation all the way to the human psyche.
So let's start with the hard reality. Let's start with the grid. I want to tell you a story I've pieced together from some of this source material. This is an account from a technician in the Pacific Northwest. Yeah. And this isn't a hypothetical. This is the reality on the ground.
This is the engineer's dilemma.
Right. So imagine a guy, let's call him Mark. He's a veteran electrical engineer. He's got 30 years in the game. This is a guy who he knows the smell of ozone from an arcsing switch. He knows the specific hum of a high voltage transformer by heart.
The kind of institutional knowledge you can't get from a textbook. It's lived experience.
Exactly. He can tell you if a substation is healthy just by standing next to the fence and listening. That's the level of expertise we're talking about. So, Mark is sitting in a boardroom. It's 2026. The room is all glass and brushed steel. You know the type.
I can picture it.
He's there to present a report. And the title of his report is Structural Entropy in the Pacific Intertie. He has data, hard data. He has charts showing that several key substations are on the verge of thermal meltdown.
He's bringing a physics problem to the management table.
A serious one. The copper is fatigued. The insulating oil in the transformers is degraded. He's telling them these are ticking time bombs. He's there to talk about physics. But the people at the table, they're not engineers.
Of course not.
He's sitting across from the Sustainability Compliance Officer and the new VP of Stakeholder Alignment. And before he can even get to his second slide about copper fatigue, they stop him. They make him sit through a 2-hour presentation on their new ESG-driven procurement policy.
Let me guess. This policy wasn't about procuring the most reliable transformers on the planet.
Not even in the same universe. The new policy was all about prioritizing, and I'm quoting here, community-aligned suppliers. They wanted to shift their entire supply chain away from these highly specialized German and Japanese firms.
Ones who, actually make the best heavy-duty electrical gear in the world.
The very same.
Yeah.
And they wanted to move it towards smaller local vendors who met a very specific, very long checklist of social criteria.
Even if those vendors have never built a 500 kilovolt transformer in their lives.
That's the part that's just, it's mind-boggling. Mark tries to explain this. He says very patiently, look, I don't care about their community alignment. I care about whether the ceramic insulators can handle 230 kilovolts in a lightning storm without exploding. He's trying to be practical.
And this is where the clash happens.
This is it. The Sustainability Compliance Officer, who has never set foot in a substation, just interrupts him.
Here comes the blank stare.
She looks at him, not with anger, but with this sort of placid confusion. And she says, our reporting metrics are fantastic. We are leading the industry in supply chain equity. These technical concerns about entropy feel like you're resisting the necessary culture change we're trying to implement here.
Oh, that is the entire conflict in a single sentence. You have one person speaking the language of electrons and heat and material science.
And another person speaking the language of human resources and public relations. And the terrifying thing is, in that room, the HR language wins. It has more power.
It's a total breakdown of communication. They're operating in two different realities.
And Mark had this terrible realization in that moment. The grid wasn't failing because they ran out of power or even ran out of money. It was failing because competence, actual technical mastery of a subject had been devalued. It had been traded away for social signaling.
And the grid, well, the grid doesn't run on signals. It runs on electrons.
It doesn't know about the new procurement policy. It just knows about Ohm's law.
You mentioned that term Mark used, structural entropy. I want to start there for a second because I think it's easy for us and for you listening to just gloss over that as, technobabble.
Yeah, that was my first reaction. When I first read Entropy, I just thought of, the general concept of things getting messy, disorder, a coffee cup breaking and not putting itself back together.
That's the classic thermodynamic definition, and it's related. But in network theory, and specifically when we're talking about power grids, structural entropy is something much more specific. It's a measurable mathematical quantity. It's a way of quantifying how fragile the entire system is.
Okay, break that down for us. How do you measure the entropy of a power line? What does that even mean?
Okay, think of the grid like a spider web, a perfect, strong spider web. In a low entropy, healthy web, the strands are distributed pretty evenly. The load is shared. If a fly hits one part of the web, the stress is immediately shared across hundreds of other strands. No single strand is doing all the work. It's resilient. It has redundancy. It's safe.
So uniformity or homogeneity is good. It's strong.
But what the researchers at TU Delft found is that our grid, over decades, has become incredibly heterogeneous. And that's the high entropy state. Instead of that uniform, resilient web, we've developed these massive critical hubs.
Hubs?
Yeah, think of it like an airline map. You don't have direct flights from every small town to every other small town. You have hubs like Atlanta or Chicago. Almost all the traffic flows through a few critical points. The grid has evolved the same way. The metric they use is electrical node significance.
So some points in the grid are way more important than others.
Way more. Imagine if, instead of that spider web, you had a system where 90% of the strands were barely holding anything. just connecting minor points, and 10% of the strands were holding up the entire structure. Those 10%, those are the critical hubs.
That sounds incredibly dangerous, because if one of those hubs snaps,
the whole thing comes down. The researchers talk about node out degree. It's a fancy way of asking, how many connections does this one specific substation have? And what we've been doing for years, especially as we've added more renewable sources, huge wind farms in the middle of Iowa, massive solar arrays out in the Mojave Desert, we haven't rebuilt the whole web.
we've just plugged them into the nearest big node.
We've plugged them into the hubs. We are concentrating the load, increasing the complexity, and putting more and more stress on these few critical points without reinforcing the underlying foundation.
It's like we keep adding floors to a skyscraper without ever checking the concrete in the basement.
Technology.
Yeah.
And this leads to something they call a power law failure distribution. This is a really critical concept to get your head around.
Okay, I've heard this term before, usually in relation to things like wealth distribution or city sizes. How does it apply to a blackout?
Well, normally we think in terms of bell curves, right? Most days are average temperature, sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cold, and very rarely there's a record-breaking heat wave. It's a nice, predictable curve. In a bell curve world, blackouts are small and local. A tree falls on a line, a single neighborhood goes dark. Manageable.
Well, yeah, that's what we're used to.
But complex networks, and the power grid is one of the most complex networks humanity has ever built. They don't operate on bell curves. They operate on power laws. In a power law distribution, extreme events are exponentially more likely than you would intuitively think.
So a huge cascading blackout isn't a freak accident. It's a predictable feature of the system structure.
It is an inherent property of a high entropy network.
Yeah.
Because the system is so interconnected and so dependent on these hubs, if one of those super hubs fails, say, because of that copper fatigue Mark was warning about, it doesn't just go dark locally.
So what happens?
The power that was flowing through that hub, we're talking gigawatts of energy. It has to go somewhere. The laws of physics demand it. So instantly, in milliseconds, that massive load shifts to the neighboring nodes in the network.
But those neighboring nodes are probably already near their own capacity?
Of course they are. They're already stressed. So they overload and their circuit breakers trip within a fraction of a second. Then that load, plus their own load, shifts again to the next ring of nodes further out. It's a cascade. It's a line of dominoes falling, but at nearly the speed of light.
And this is what the engineer, what Mark sees in his nightmares. He sees the math. He sees the node out degree spiking on his charts, and he's trying to explain this impending system-level collapse to a compliance officer who thinks he's just being difficult about a new vendor policy.
It's a complete failure to communicate risk. The officer is worried about the narrative of the supply chain. Mark is worried about the physics of a cascading failure that could take out the entire eastern seaboard. And those two concerns aren't just different. They are fundamentally incompatible. You cannot fix structural entropy with a press release.
And it gets worse, because it's not just the internal structure that's rotting away. That would be bad enough. But we also have these reports from Strider Technologies and the Department of Energy about what they call external threats. It seems like we aren't just letting the grid decay through neglect. We are actively importing vulnerability.
This is the In Broad Daylight report. And honestly, reading through it, it's one of the most alarming things in the entire stack of material we have. It focuses on something called IBRs.
Inverter Based Resources.
Right. And we should probably define that for people. An inverter is basically the box that takes DC power, like from a solar panel or a battery, and turns it into the AC power that runs through the grid and into your house.
Dimple it.
It used to be. But in 2026, these aren't just dumb boxes of coils and magnets anymore. A modern industrial-scale inverter is a powerful computer. It has a processor, it has memory, it has firmware, and most importantly, it has a network connection.
So it's a smart device. It's part of the Internet of Things.
It's a smart device that controls the flow of massive amounts of electricity. It talks to the grid control systems, it manages frequency, it regulates voltage, it balances the load. It's the brain of the modern grid. And the Strider report found that the U.S. grid is becoming critically dependent on inverters made by PRC-based companies.
Specifically companies like SunGrow and BYD.
And we're not talking about small numbers here. The report identified 5,400 megawatts of capacity across 22 states using this equipment.
Put that number in perspective for us. How big is 5,400 megawatts?
It's enormous. That's more than 5 large nuclear power plants worth of electricity. It's enough to power millions of homes. And all that power is being managed by hardware and software designed and built by companies with deep ties to a strategic adversary.
And because these are networked devices, they're hackable.
They're more than hackable. They are potential vectors for a coordinated attack. The report specifically calls out a group named Typhoon.
That sounds like a villain from a bad 80s action movie, but I know it's very real.
Very real. It is a state-sponsored cyber warfare group from the PRC, and the U.S. intelligence community has caught them red-handed, not just probing our infrastructure, but pre-positioning themselves inside it, living off the land.
So they're not just knocking on the door, they're already inside the house just waiting.
Exactly. The fear isn't that they'll spy on us or steal data. The fear is that these inverters have built-in backdoors or kill switches, that in a moment of geopolitical crisis, say a conflict over Taiwan, they don't need to launch a single missile at the U.S. mainland.
They just send a command.
They send a single encrypted packet over the internet. They can instruct thousands of these inverters across 22 states to desynchronize from the grid at the exact same moment.
Which would trigger that cascading failure we just talked about?
It would be the trigger. Instantly. It would induce a massive nationwide structural entropy event. You'd be forcing the grid to tear itself apart from the inside out. It's the perfect asymmetric weapon.
And all of this is happening while, according to the DOE report, we have a massive capacity crunch because of the explosion in AI.
Right. AI data centers are power hogs on a scale we've never seen before. So demand is skyrocketing at the exact same time that the internal structure is rotting from neglect, and the new hardware we're installing to meet that demand is potentially a Trojan horse.
It's a perfect storm.
It's a perfect storm of incompetence and vulnerability.
And the people at the top, the people in those glass-walled conference rooms who should be losing sleep over Typhoon and thermal limits and no doubt degree.
They're busy. They're hiring directors of narrative integration.
It makes you ask the question, how did we get here? I mean, this feels insane. Societies generally try not to collapse. How do you build a system where a director of narrative integration is a more valuable and higher-ranking employee than the chief engineer who keeps the lights on? It feels perverse.
That word you just used, perverse, is actually the perfect academic term for it. It's the key that unlocks the whole sociology of this mess. And it brings us to the next part of our autopsy. The pathology of bureaucracy.
We're talking about the Perversity thesis.
Exactly, and this comes from a really brilliant paper by Abigail Faust on the history of the term unintended consequences. It's a fascinating look at how our entire understanding of cause and effect in society has shifted over time.
I have to admit, I always thought unintended consequences was just a polite way of saying, oops, my plan backfired.
Well, it used to be much more optimistic than that. If you go back to the 18th century, to Adam Smith, or even to the early 20th century sociologist Robert Merton, unintended consequences were often seen as a good thing. The invisible hand of the market is the classic example.
Right. The baker bakes bread, not out of the goodness of his heart, but to make a profit. That's his intent.
And the unintended consequence of his selfish action is that the whole town gets fed. Private vice, public virtue. The idea was that individual actions could aggregate into a positive social result without anyone planning it.
But that's not what we mean by it anymore, is it?
Well, in the late 20th century, especially with the influence of the Chicago School of Economics, the meaning completely flipped. It became the Perversity thesis. The idea that purposeful, planned action, usually by the government or a large institution, to improve a social condition often ends up making that exact condition worse.
So it doesn't just fail. It actively backfires. It produces the opposite of its stated goal.
And the psychological mechanism for this is often what's called the Peltzman effect.
I love this concept. It's one of those ideas that once you hear it, you start seeing it absolutely everywhere.
It's a powerful lens. Sam Peltzman was an economist, and back in the 1970s, he was studying the effects of new auto safety regulations. The government had just mandated things like seat belts, collapsible steering columns, padded dashboards. The logic was simple and linear. Safer cars will equal fewer deaths.
Seems obvious. If I'm in a crash but I can't fly through the windshield, I'm much more likely to survive.
And that part was true. Fatalities per accident for drivers went down. But Peltzman, being a good economist, looked at the rest of the data, and he noticed something strange. The total number of accidents went up. And even stranger, the number of pedestrian deaths from car accidents went up.
How does that happen?
Because the drivers changed their behavior. The psychological term for it is risk compensation. Human beings, it turns out, have a sort of internal risk thermostat. We are all comfortable with a certain level of danger in our lives. If you force safety on us, if you strap us into a seatbelt and put an airbag in front of our face, we feel too safe. Our thermostat reading is too low.
So we compensate. We seek out more risk to get back to our comfort level.
Exactly. We start driving faster, we follow closer, we take corners harder, we pay a little less attention to the road because, subconsciously, we know the consequences of making a small mistake have been dramatically lowered. We outsource our personal sense of caution to the safety equipment.
Okay, I see it. Now, take that exact logic and apply it to our friend, the chief sustainability officer at the utility company.
Let's do it. He's the driver. So what is his seatbelt? What's his airbag?
His seatbelt is that ecological equity framework. His airbag is the top-tier ESG certificate hanging on the conference room wall.
That is a powerful metaphor.
Yeah.
Because you have to ask, what is the biggest risk in his world?
From his perspective, it's not a blackout. A blackout is just external noise. The biggest danger he faces is a PR crisis. It's being called out in the media for being out of touch or non-inclusive. It's reputational damage.
So by hiring the director of narrative integration and getting that ESG score, he has buckled his seatbelt against the PR crash. He has installed an airbag to protect him from social critique.
He feels safe. He feels virtuous, he feels protected, and because he feels so incredibly safe on the narrative front,
he drives recklessly on the physical front.
He takes his eyes off the road. He stops paying attention to the boring, gritty details of maintenance and engineering and copper fatigue. The Peltzman effect predicts that the more virtuous and safe an institution believes itself to be according to its chosen metrics, the more careless and incompetent it will become at its actual core function.
That explains the blank stare. He genuinely did not believe the power outage mattered because his personal and institutional risk thermostat was set to safe, thanks to all his paperwork.
And this ties directly into something the political scientist Charles Murray called the law of unintended rewards. When you set up a system like this, you get more of what you reward. If investors, regulators, and the media reward companies for producing narrative integration, you are going to get a lot of narrative integration.
And you're going to get a lot less electricity.
The administrative bloat, the narrative-producing part of the organization, consumes the functional tissue. You hire 10 people to manage the story for every one person you hire to actually fix the wires, and eventually you cross a tipping point. The organism becomes a parasite on itself, consuming its own ability to function in the real world.
So let's just recap where we are. We have a physical system, the grid, that is rotting from the inside due to structural entropy. It's actively threatened from the outside by sophisticated adversaries, and it's being managed by a class of people who are psychologically insulated from physical reality by their own bureaucratic safety mechanisms.
A perfect storm of incompetence.
Yes.
So naturally, when people start to see this, when the outages become more frequent and the rot becomes obvious, the instinct is to say, we have to fix this. We have to cut out the cancer, to perform surgery.
Which brings us to the DOGE reforms.
The Department of Governmental Efficiency. This idea of radical debureaucratization. Strip it all down, fire the narrative managers, get back to basics. And, on paper, it sounds great. It sounds like exactly what's needed. But I have an account here that suggests surgery on a patient this sick is.
Well, it's very complicated.
Let's hear it.
I was reading through some leaked internal memos describing the fallout of these DOGE reforms inside a federal regulatory office. So this wasn't the utility company itself. This was the government body that was supposed to be overseeing critical infrastructure.
The watchdog.
Exactly. So the cuts came down. They were massive, huge budget slashes. Entire layers of middle management were just gone. The stated goal was efficiency, speed, accountability. But I want you to picture a mid-level administrator who survived the purge. Let's call him David.
David the survivor. Okay.
David is sitting at his desk. Half the cubicles in his section are empty. The director of stakeholder alignment is gone. The VP of interagency synergy is gone. This should be a good thing, right? The dead wood is cleared out. But David is terrified.
Why?
He kept his job.
Because along with the budget cuts came a new sweeping mandate from the top. Skin in the game.
So they read Nassim Taleb.
So, the mandate was simple and brutal. It said that any administrator who signs off on a permit, a regulation, or a project is now personally and professionally accountable for the outcome. If you approve a new bridge design and it develops cracks a year later, it's on your record. Maybe you lose your pension. Maybe you get fired and can't work in government again.
It sounds like accountability. I mean, isn't that what we want? Decision makers who bear the consequences of their decisions.
Theoretically, absolutely yes. But you have to look at who David is. He is a bureaucrat. He has spent 20 years of his life in a system specifically designed to diffuse responsibility, to make sure no single person can ever be blamed for anything.
His entire career has been about avoiding risk, not taking it.
That's why he took a government job in the first place, for the stability, the predictability, the lack of personal risk. His professional instincts have been honed for 2 decades to never, ever make a decision that could come back to bite him. He's never had to make a real choice. He's only ever processed forms that someone else, somewhere higher up the chain, had already implicitly approved.
And now suddenly you're telling him that every signature carries infinite risk.
If he signs the permit for that new high-voltage power line and something goes wrong 5 years from now, he's toast. But if he doesn't sign it, well, what's the consequence of inaction?
Nothing happens. The project stays in limbo, and nobody ever gets fired for a file that's still marked pending review.
So he freezes. He turtles. The memo described a state of what it called administrative entropy. The remaining staff were so paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake under the new skin-in-the-game rules that they simply stopped working. Critical infrastructure permits for grid upgrades sat on desks for months untouched, not because of red tape or too much bureaucracy, but because of the exact opposite. Too much personal responsibility placed on people who were psychologically incapable of handling it.
It's a moral hazard in reverse. It's the Perversity thesis all over again. The action intended to create accountability actually created total paralysis.
The attempt to fix the system by introducing risk actually killed the patient. It turns out if you take an organism that has evolved over decades to have no spine, and you suddenly demand that it stand up straight, it just collapses into a pile on the floor.
This is such a profound insight into the difficulty of real reform. Taleb's skin in the game is the correct philosophical answer. Of course, decision-makers should bear the consequences, but the unintended consequence of applying that principle, cold turkey, to a hollowed-out bureaucracy is paralysis.
It's the autopsy again. We cut the patient open to remove the bureaucratic tumor, but we found the patient's heart stopped on the table because it was too weak to handle the anesthesia of accountability.
So you can't just fire the incompetent people. And you can't just scare the remaining people into being competent. You have to have someone competent and willing to take risks to take the wheel. Which begs the question, if the boardroom is delusional and the bureaucracy is paralyzed, where are all the competent people?
Because they haven't all just vanished from the earth. They're still out there. The engineers who still know Ohm's law, the software architects who can build stable systems, the logisticians who know how to move things from A to B.
They're still here, but they're not in the boardroom anymore. And they're not in that government office.
Right.
They've gone underground.
And this brings us to the final and maybe most important part of our deep dive, this idea of the parallel polis. And I'll be honest, this was the part of the research that gave me a glimmer of real hope, but also a very deep sense of unease.
It's a survival strategy.
Exactly. I want to share a specific account from the source material. It's about a software architect. Let's call her Sarah. She works for a major tech firm, one of the giants, you know, the kind.
The kind with the free lunches, the nap pods, and the mandatory monthly sensitivity training seminars.
The works. Now, Sarah is brilliant, genuinely. She builds the complex back-end systems that keep the cloud running, but she described to the researcher this psychological defense mechanism she had to develop just to get through a Monday morning staff meeting.
You want?
She said that the semantic corruption at her firm had reached a breaking point. What she meant was she could no longer use standard objective technical terms without being flagged by HR.
What kind of terms are we talking about?
Basic fundamental engineering terms. Things like master-slave database architecture, or blacklist-whitelist for network access, or even telling a junior programmer to run a sanity check on their code. All of these were flagged by an automated internal system as problematic, non-inclusive, or potentially harmful language.
So the language of engineering, a precise and objective discipline, was being policed by the language of ideology.
It got to the point where she felt she couldn't think clearly anymore. She called it a direct threat to her cognitive sovereignty. If you have to constantly filter your technical thoughts through a political lens before you can speak or write them, you become a worse engineer. Your code gets sloppier because your thinking gets sloppy. The precision is lost.
So what does she do? Did she quit?
No. She has a mortgage, kids. She needed the paycheck. So she did something else. She and a small group of other functionalists, other senior engineers, a couple of doctors from a local hospital, a logistics expert from a shipping company who were all facing the same problem, they started meeting in secret.
Like a book club?
Sort of, like a fight club for math. They set up a private end-to-end encrypted server, completely off the corporate grid, not tied to any of their real names. And in there, they talk. They share code. They review each other's side projects. They help each other solve complex problems. But the one unbreakable rule of the server is Plain, unadorned English only.
No buzzwords.
No buzzwords, no ideology, just objective reality. A place where an algorithm is either efficient or it's not. Where a diagnosis is either correct or incorrect. A place where 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of how that conclusion makes anyone feel.
They created a sanctuary for competence.
That's what Sarah called it. She said it wasn't about starting a revolution or overthrowing the company. It was about sanity maintenance. It was a psychological lifeboat. They needed a place where they could speak the language of physics and logic just to remember how to think straight.
You know, this concept, the parallel polis, it isn't new. It has a very specific and powerful history. It comes directly from the dissident movements in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. It was coined by a Czech philosopher, Václav Benda, and it was made famous by Václav Havel.
The playwright who ended up becoming the president of Czechoslovakia.
The very same. In his most famous essay, The Power of the Powerless, Havel tells this incredible parable, the parable of the greengrocer.
I love this story. It's so simple and so profound. Break it down for anyone who hasn't heard it.
Okay, so you have to picture a greengrocer. He runs a small fruit and vegetable shop in 1970s communist Prague, and every morning he gets a delivery from the state. Along with his onions and carrots, he gets a small sign with a slogan printed on it. The slogan is, "Workers of the world, unite." And he's expected to put this sign in his shop window.
Does the greengrocer actually believe in the global solidarity of the proletariat?
Of course not. He's just trying to sell his carrots. He probably thinks the Communist Party is full of idiots who are ruining the country. He knows the slogan is a lie. Everyone knows it's a lie.
So why does he put it in the window?
He does it out of a mixture of fear and convenience. He does it because everyone else does it. He does it because if he's the one guy who doesn't put up the sign, the neighborhood party informant will report him. He might lose his license to operate the shop. His kids might be denied entry to university. The sign isn't a statement of belief. It's a signal.
A signal of obedience.
Exactly. It says to the authorities, "I am obedient. I will play the game. I will not cause trouble. Please leave me alone." Havel calls this living within the lie. The greengrocer adopts the meaningless ritual to survive. But the cost is a piece of his integrity. The cost is that he becomes a cog in the machine of the very system that oppresses him.
And Sarah, our software architect, when she sits in that Monday morning meeting and nods along when the presenter talks about decolonizing the code base.
She is the greengrocer. She is putting the sign in the window. She is living within the lie so she can keep her job and pay her mortgage.
But the private encrypted server, that's something different.
That is the parallel polis. That is the second culture. Benda and Havel argued that you couldn't fight the totalitarian state head-on. It was too powerful. It had all the guns. So instead, you build parallel structures in the shadows. Parallel education if the state schools teach propaganda. A parallel economy if the state economy is corrupt. Parallel science, art, and philosophy. Structures that operate on principles of truth, not ideology.
So if the university is teaching lies, you hold a true history seminar in your living room with trusted friends.
You do. You create a space, however small, where you can live within the truth. And Havel's great insight was that simply deciding to live within the truth is the ultimate threat to a system built on lies. The moment the greengrocer wakes up one morning and says, "You know what, I'm not putting that stupid sign in the window today." The moment the engineer stands up in the boardroom and says, "This isn't about supply chain equity, it's about physics," the illusion shatters.
The world of appearances, as he called it, collapses.
But here is the critical and frankly terrifying difference between the parallel polis of Prague in 1978 and the one we're seeing emerge in 2026.
What's that?
In 1978, the parallel polis was about preserving culture literature, band music, philosophy, history. In 2026, the parallel polis is about preserving competence. The people hiding on these encrypted servers aren't just reading banned books. They're the only ones left to remember how to design a stable power grid, or write efficient code, or perform complex surgery without worrying about the patient's pronouns.
That is the synthesis of this entire deep dive, isn't it? We have a brain drain, but it's an internal brain drain. The competence hasn't left the country. It has simply fled the official institutions. It's hiding from the HR department on encrypted servers and in private chat rooms.
Competence has divorced power. That's the core finding of the autopsy. Power is held by the people with the slide decks and the ESG certificates, the people who believe they can talk a transformer into working again. Competence is held by the people who are in hiding, the functionalists in the parallel polis.
And the danger, the ultimate terrifying danger, is that the parallel polis doesn't run the main power grid. Not yet, anyway.
No. Sarah's private server can't fix that substation 3 miles from the utility headquarters. That substation is still under the control of the sustainability compliance officer. The parallel polis can preserve knowledge, but it cannot, at this moment, apply it to the real world's failing infrastructure.
So we are in this terrifying interim period. The official structures are failing because they are fundamentally at war with physical reality. The competent people have retreated into lifeboats to preserve the knowledge of how to build things. And the rest of us, we're just on the deck of the sinking ship, waiting for the lights to finally go out for good.
It suggests that the lights will go out, and that they won't come back on until the official structures have collapsed to a point where reality forces everyone to let the competent people out of the basement and put them back in charge.
Oh, that is a heavy thought. But looking at all this material, it feels like the only conclusion that fits the data. Let's just try and recap this journey because we have covered a massive amount of ground.
We started with the physical failure. The grid itself suffering from structural entropy, the overloaded hubs, the fatigued copper, and that was all compounded by the external threat of compromised PRC inverters and state-sponsored groups like Typhoon.
Then we diagnosed the cause of the neglect. Not a lack of money, but an ideological tumor. We looked at the Perversity thesis and the Peltzman effect. We saw how feeling safe in a narrative of social virtue allows an entire institution to act with staggering recklessness toward physical reality.
Then we looked at the chaotic attempt to fix it with the DOGE reforms, and we saw how that backfired, how trying to surgically remove the bureaucracy revealed a paralyzing administrative entropy because the people left were too terrified of skin in the game to actually function.
And finally, we found where the competence has taken refuge, in the parallel polis, in the secret networks of the Sarahs and the Marks who are keeping the flame of objective truth and technical knowledge alive in secret, waiting for the moment when reality finally breaks the door down.
It's a pretty sobering picture. It tells us that you can't just vote your way out of this, and you can't regulate your way out of it. We as a society have to somehow relearn how to live in the real world again.
And that brings us to the end of this deep dive. I just want to leave you with this final thought. We spend so much of our time, so much energy, debating the narrative, who controls the message, who frames the story, but we forget that the physical world has no ears for our stories. A bridge does not care about the diversity statement of the engineering firm that built it. It cares only about load-bearing ratios and tensile strength. We are entering an era where the luxury of interpreting reality is ending. The light staying on is not a policy preference, it is a physics problem. And as we continue this autopsy, the final finding might be this. Civilization is not maintained by the people writing the rules, but by the quiet few who, despite the rules, remember how to keep the machines running.